It always begins the same way, quietly, almost unnoticeably. You're caught in a moment of ordinary life, maybe scrolling mindlessly through something forgettable, maybe finishing your last sip of coffee, maybe sitting in silence after a long day, and then with no warning, your phone lights up. Just a vibration, a soft glow, a notification you didn't expect. But when your eyes catch the name ... everything stills. Not just your body, but your breath, your thoughts, your sense of time. It's a name you had once memorized, not because you tried to, but because they became part of your every waking moment. A name you hadn't seen in what feels like forever. A name that once made your heart race, and now it makes your entire body freeze. You had told yourself countless times that if they ever reached out again, you'd feel nothing. That you would be strong, cold, unbothered. You even rehearsed the possible scenarios in your head, convincing yourself that you had grown, that you were past them, that their return, if it ever happened, would feel irrelevant. And yet here you are, just looking, no movement, no reply, just you, the screen, and that one message. Hey, that's all it says. One word, harmless to anyone else, devastating to you. Not because it's romantic, not because it means anything concrete, but because it hits that precise place in your chest where all the unresolved things still quietly sit. And in that instant, you're not confused by the word itself. You're confused by everything it brings up without saying a thing. You thought you'd be excited, maybe relieved, maybe even flattered. But instead, you just sit there watching that notification like it's a question you're not ready to answer. And maybe, just maybe, that's because you already know the answer. You know deep down that this isn't love. It isn't closure. It's not even guilt. It's a test. Because no one who once vanished, no one who ghosted you, silenced you, overlooked your presence, ever texts out of nowhere. There's no such thing. Behind every message like this, there is a reason. And a reason almost never has to do with genuine longing. More often than not, it's a flicker of curiosity, a bruised ego, a fleeting insecurity, a moment of boredom disguised as nostalgia. It's not that they miss you. It's that they miss what your response once gave them. The power, the reassurance, the attention, the certainty that no matter how much time had passed, they could reach out and you'd still be there, soft, open, welcoming, a safety net dressed as affection. And this time, they're testing to see if that net is still hanging. But what they don't realize yet, what they're about to learn, is that you are no longer who you were when they left. There's a reason why this moment feels so heavy, even though the message is light. Because on the surface, it's just a word. But in your body, it reverberates like a distant echo from a version of you that used to hope for this very thing. A version that used to replay conversations in the middle of the night. That used to refresh chats just to feel seen. That used to analyze silences like they were coded messages. That version was soft, vulnerable, sincere, and too often taken for granted. So now, with this single word blinking on your screen, you're not reacting, you're reflecting. You're not rushing, you're remembering. You're not romanticizing. Their reappearance, you're recognizing the pattern. And you realize something. You're not shocked because they reached out. You're shocked because for the first time, you don't feel the need to reply. That hesitation you feel, it's not weakness, it's wisdom. It's the sign of someone who's grown through silence. Someone who's learned slowly and painfully that not every message is meant to be opened, and not every reappearance deserves a stage. Because this message, this hey, is not about connection. It's about access. They want to know if the door is still open, if the key they once held still fits the lock. But what they don't understand is that the lock has been changed, and this version of you no longer lives in the same house. You've moved, not physically, but emotionally, mentally, energetically. You no longer wait in the same place they left you. You no longer reach for crumbs and call it care. You no longer ache for attention that only shows up when it's convenient. And now that you've built something solid inside, now that your peace has roots, they return, unannounced, and expect to be received like royalty. But this isn't their kingdom anymore. It's yours. And your first act of sovereignty? To pause, to observe, to hold the moment and not let it hold you. Because when you don't react the way they expected, when you don't rush, don't gush, don't fall, you do more than confuse them. You disarm them. You shift the power. You make silence louder than any reply. So you keep holding that phone. You feel the impulse, the temptation, the tug of memory. But you don't move. Not because you're playing games, but because you've stopped playing theirs. This isn't manipulation. It's self-preservation. This is how emotional control begins. Not with a dramatic statement, not with anger, not even with closure, but with a quiet decision not to respond right away. And maybe you will respond later, with clarity, with firmness, on your terms. Or maybe you won't reply at all, because sometimes the most dignified response is none. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. What matters now isn't what they said, it's what you choose to do with it, and for the first time, maybe ever, that choice is fully, completely yours. If you've ever paused at a message and felt torn between instinct and intention, remember this. Clarity doesn't come from quick replies. It comes from conscious presence. Subscribe to True Stoic Way for more insights like this, and walk the path of power, one silent choice at a time. There's something disarming about the simplicity of a message that reads, "Hey, I was just thinking about you." At first glance, it feels harmless, almost sweet even. It lands like a gentle whisper from the past, soft enough to trigger memories, light enough to seem innocent. But beneath that carefully casual surface lies something far more calculated. And if you're not paying close attention, if you're still emotionally tethered to who you once were when they had access to you, it becomes easy to confuse ego for affection and nostalgia for sincerity. These kinds of messages often arrive wrapped in charm but hollow in intent. "I missed your energy. I hope you're doing okay. I don't know why, but you crossed my mind today." They all carry the same tone, a blend of mystery, familiarity, and just enough vagueness to keep you emotionally engaged. But the question you must learn to ask yourself every single time is this: why now? Because real affection doesn't operate on convenience. It doesn't stay silent for weeks, months, or even years, only to reappear on a random Thursday night when boredom creeps in. It doesn't vanish when you're vulnerable and return when you've finally rebuilt. And more importantly, it doesn't come with such little effort. When someone truly misses you for who you are, not for how you made them feel about themselves, They don't test the waters with one-liners. They don't dangle half-hearted messages hoping to reignite something they let die. They show up with clarity, with consistency, with care. Anything less than that is not love. It's not even longing. It's ego. And ego is a master of disguise. You see, the truth behind many of these surprise messages isn't rooted in genuine reconnection. It's in the need to verify access, to check if the cord they once pulled still lights the same reaction, if you'll still reply within seconds, if they can still feel that subtle surge of control just by saying hello. And if you answer too quickly, too warmly, too eagerly, get their confirmation. They don't need to say another word, because now they know they still matter. They still own a piece of you, not because you gave it freely, but because you didn't take it back. What's dangerous here is that their words often feel like closure in disguise. But closure never starts with vague affection. Closure doesn't show up with no context, no apology, no accountability. Closure is earned through effort, not borrowed through small talk. And yet, how many times have you felt a flicker of hope from just one line? How many times has one casual message pulled you back into a space you worked so hard to escape? This is the emotional boomerang where absence creates desire, desire creates response, and response reopens the loop. The loop they control. The loop you keep trying to close, only to find yourself caught inside it again. But here's the part. They never calculate that you might have grown, that you might have seen through the pattern, that this time when they said, hey, you didn't lean forward, you leaned back, you observed, you questioned, and in doing so, you began to dismantle the illusion that kept you tied to them. Because when you start separating real emotion from emotional strategy, you reclaim your center. You stop reacting to words designed to stir your old self and start responding from the strength of your new one. So let's break it down plainly. They're not always thinking about you. They're thinking about how they felt when you used to need them. They don't miss your presence, they miss your availability. They're not reaching out because they've changed. They're reaching out because you did. Because your silence suddenly created a vacuum they didn't expect. Because not having access to you challenged the idea that they could always come and go at will. And when the ego feels threatened, it gets crafty. It puts on a mask of kindness. It pretends to remember what was once shared. But it never truly owns the damage it caused. Instead, it checks if the door is still ajar, just wide enough to sneak back in, not with sincerity, but with the same games that once worked before. That's the crucial difference between nostalgia and manipulation. Nostalgia might make you feel warm, but it doesn't ask for anything. It accepts the past for what it was. Manipulation, however, looks like nostalgia until you realize it wants something back. It wants control. It wants reassurance. It wants to know you're still there. And the moment you offer that assurance, even subtly, it smiles quietly. Because the power has shifted again. But you're not here to be anyone's emotional safety net anymore. You're not here to soothe the bruised egos of people who only remember you when their lives get quiet. You're not here to keep the door open for someone who didn't knock when it truly mattered. You've seen the loop. Now break it. And if you ever find yourself holding the phone, rereading their message for the 5th time, wondering if this one is different, pause. Ask yourself, is this message about connection or control? That one question alone could save you from repeating the past. If you've ever received one of those vague messages and felt the storm of doubt begin to rise, don't forget to hit subscribe to True Stoic Way. This channel exists to help you stay awake inside emotional illusions and walk through moments like this with calm, clarity, and power. There's a silent power in not responding immediately, a kind of authority that doesn't shout or demand, but instead settles into the room like a shift in gravity. And when you first choose not to answer that message, when you look at the screen, feel the familiar tug in your chest, and yet do nothing, it's in that quiet, deliberate moment that the rules of the game begin to change. Because up until now, they've always relied on your reaction. They knew your patterns. They knew that a simple text, a vague apology, or a sudden hey was enough to stir the waters. They had grown used to your immediacy, to your openness, to the way you gave without pause. In their mind, your response was a guarantee, not a gift, not a choice, a given. But this time, something's different. You saw the message, but you didn't rush to answer. You read their words, but didn't let them pull you in. You felt the familiar emotions rise, but didn't let them drag you under. And on the other side of the screen, where once there was confidence, now there is confusion. That pause you just created, seconds turning into minutes, minutes into hours, is not just about time. It's about power, because power at its core is not loud. It's still, it's intentional. It doesn't need to prove itself. And when you withhold the response they've always expected, you do more than surprise them, you destabilize them. You remove their footing. You force them to confront the echo of your absence. Something they never prepared for because they never believed you'd be capable of it. This is where the real game begins. Not the one they tried to play with you, where they moved first and you followed. No, now the board has changed, and you're no longer a piece, you're the clock. Imagine it like chess. In the past, they always went first. They made the first move knowing you would scramble to respond, react, accommodate. They pushed the pace. They controlled the tempo. But not anymore. Now you're the one holding the clock, and they're stuck waiting, eyes flicking toward their screen, wondering why you haven't responded, trying to guess what you're thinking, what you're planning, what your silence might mean. And the most unnerving part for them, they don't know. They can't tell. Because the moment you stopped reacting the way you always did, the map they used to navigate you disintegrated. Suddenly, they're no longer sure if you're upset or indifferent, if you're taking time to think or have already moved on, if you're playing hard to get or simply no longer available to be got. And that kind of uncertainty for someone who's used to controlling the rhythm of your interactions is devastating. Now, don't misunderstand this shift. Choosing silence is not about being cold. It's not about playing games or proving a point. It's about reclaiming your center. It's about understanding that you no longer owe your energy to patterns that once kept you stuck. It's about realizing that speed is not proof of sincerity, and that your time, your attention, your presence, all of it is sacred. Silence isn't passive. It's active restraint. It's emotional clarity. It's strategy in motion, because what happens in that silence is subtle, but powerful. The person on the other end begins to question what they never questioned before. Did I wait too long? Are they done with me? Did they change? And slowly, the certainty that once fed their ego begins to wither. The fantasy that you would always be there begins to collapse. And as their mind scrambles to rebuild the illusion they once held, you sit calm, grounded, watching. This isn't just about one message. It's about every interaction that comes after. Because the first moment you don't respond on cue, you introduce something they've never had to face before when dealing with you. Unpredictability. And that unpredictability forces them to confront what they've lost, not just access to you, but access to the version of you that once prioritized them over your own peace. So now, when you wait, you're not playing games. You're protecting your space. You're letting time filter truth from tactics. You're using distance to reveal intention. And in doing so, you're showing that control no longer belongs to the one who sent the message, but to the one who chooses when or whether to respond. Because when you own the timing, you own the frame. And when you own the frame, you shape the entire narrative. The power now is in your hands. If you've ever felt like your silence speaks louder than your words, you're not alone. Subscribe to True Stoic Way to learn how presence, timing, and inner control can flip the entire emotional script without ever needing to raise your voice. There is a kind of peace that doesn't arrive overnight. It isn't gifted, and it's never free. It's earned brick by silent brick, breath by trembling breath, over countless nights where you chose not to reach out, not to reopen wounds, not to beg for clarity from someone who gave you nothing but absence. That kind of peace is sacred. It is hard-won. And if you've found even a fragment of it, if you've begun to breathe again without checking your phone every hour, if you've woken up without that dull ache in your chest, then you already know how much it cost you to arrive at this moment. And that is exactly why you must protect it with everything you have. Because sometimes, all it takes to tear down what you've built is a single crack in your resolve, a single message you answer too quickly, a single illusion you entertain. For the sake of nostalgia, a single hope you let back in, forgetting the way it hollowed you out the last time. One reply sent in weakness can unravel weeks, even months, of healing you layered together in silence. One soft hey can grow into a storm if you forget who you were when the silence began and who you've become since. You must remember the nights you chose to say nothing, even when your entire body begged to say something. Remember the mornings you resisted the urge to check if they finally missed you. Remember how hard it was to sit with unanswered questions, how exhausting it felt to rebuild your self-worth piece by piece, knowing that no apology was coming. That was the crucible in which your strength was forged, not in being heard, but in choosing to be silent when silence was the only boundary you had left. And now, they're back. Not with an apology, not with clarity, not with effort. Just a lazy tap on the screen, a familiar name returning without context, without commitment, without anything real. A message like a ghost, weightless, aimless, haunting. And it's tempting to answer, not because you believe in them again, but because part of you still remembers what it was like to be seen, even if it was by the wrong person. Part of you still longs for closure. But here's the truth. What they're offering is not closure. It's not reconnection. It's not love. It's a hook. And if you're not careful, if you let your heart answer before your mind has a chance to speak, you'll find yourself tangled in the same net that took you months to escape. You'll re-enter the pattern thinking it's a conversation, when in fact it's a loop. One designed not to bring clarity, but to re-establish control. Because, and this is the part most people don't want to admit, they don't miss you. They miss how they felt when you missed them. They miss the power of knowing that a few words could pull you back in. They miss the version of you who would respond immediately, without thinking, without guarding, without remembering what it cost the last time. So when that message comes, and it will pause, not out of fear, but out of respect. Respect for your healing. Respect for your peace. Respect for the version of you who fought like hell to stop reacting and start choosing. Because choosing yourself is not always loud. Sometimes, it's just a quiet decision not to reply to something that doesn't deserve your energy. The moment you hit send without thinking, you're no longer in control. You're back on their schedule, back in their frame. And every time, you sacrifice your hard-earned clarity for a recycled conversation that leads nowhere. You teach them, and more importantly, you teach yourself that your boundaries are negotiable, that your peace can be traded for a few hollow words, that your growth is fragile, but you're not fragile. Not anymore. You're the person who stayed up crying and chose not to text. You're the person who woke up anxious and chose not to spiral. You're the person who saw their silence for what it was and walked away, not because it didn't hurt, but because it hurt too much to stay. That's strength. That's evolution. And no, I missed you, or just thinking of you gets to override that unless you let it. So think carefully. Not about what they said, but about what you've survived. Think about the mornings that were quiet because they weren't there, and how you made that silence your sanctuary. Think about how long it took you to rebuild your self-respect after handing it away in pieces. Think about what you truly want, not just what you temporarily feel. And ask yourself this: are they offering you peace, or are they threatening the one you already built? If you even hesitate on that answer, then you already know the truth. If you've ever stood at the edge of relapse into a cycle you swore you left behind, let this be your reminder: your peace is priceless. Subscribe to True Stoic Way for more clarity, more strength, and more ways to protect what you've worked so hard to reclaim. There comes a moment in your growth when you no longer see silence as avoidance, but as presence, calm, conscious, immovable presence. A moment when you begin to understand that not every message deserves a reply, not every apology deserves a second chance, and not every flicker of interest deserves your attention. And in that moment, your relationship with silence shifts entirely. It's no longer the uncomfortable void you once rushed to fill, no longer the space that made you anxious or uncertain. Instead, it becomes your ally, your shield, your most articulate answer in a world obsessed with reaction. You see, silence is not the absence of emotion, it's the elevation of it. It is the decision to observe instead of react, to pause instead of pounce, to respond only when clarity is present, and only if it serves your peace. When you choose silence, especially after receiving a message that was designed to provoke curiosity, you're not ghosting, you're guarding. You're not ignoring, you're evaluating. And that distinction is everything. The old version of you probably equated silence with punishment or manipulation. Maybe you were told that not answering was cruel, that waiting too long to respond meant you didn't care. But you've outgrown those assumptions. Because now you know that emotional maturity isn't about speed, it's about stability. You don't need to be cold. You just need to be clear. And clarity begins when you stop feeling responsible for making other people comfortable with your boundaries. So when someone reaches out with vague affection, with a casual "hey" or a sudden "you crossed my mind," and you feel that familiar tug in your chest, the urge to answer quickly, to reciprocate warmth, to not seem distant, pause, not to play a game, but to protect your energy. Because that delay, even if it's just a few hours or one full day, is not just about buying time. It's a strategic act of self-respect. Let it be 1 day, 2, even 3. Watch what they do. Watch what they don't do. See whether their interest holds up under the weight of silence, or whether it collapses the moment they don't get the attention they were fishing for. That alone will reveal more than any conversation ever could. Because someone who truly values you will not vanish. When their opening move doesn't go as planned, they'll follow up. They'll show effort. They'll respect the pace you set, not pressure you to return to the pace that once left you breathless. The truth is, many people send messages not to connect, but to confirm. To confirm that they still exist in your mind, that they still have access, that the thread between you hasn't been severed. They're not seeking intimacy, they're seeking evidence. Evidence that they are still relevant, still wanted, still powerful. But you are not an emotional litmus test. You are not here to validate the presence of someone who only shows up when they feel empty. So the next time you feel the impulse to reply, instantly stop. Ask yourself, am I responding out of clarity or out of habit? Am I truly interested in this exchange, or am I just trying not to feel uncomfortable with silence? Because silence isn't the enemy. It's the filter. It reveals what words try to hide. It shows you who's genuine and who's just circling back because your absence made too much noise. And if you're worried that delaying a reply makes you seem cold, remind yourself, coldness is when you use silence to punish. But what you're doing isn't punishment, it's preservation. You're choosing not to let old patterns pull you back into emotional territory you've already outgrown. You're not retreating, you're redefining. And the space you create by waiting is the same space that allows you to choose wisely, not impulsively. When they don't get the instant response they expected, two things happen. First, they begin to question their assumption that they still matter to you in the same way. Second, they realize, maybe for the first time, that the version of you who used to rush toward them is no longer in charge. And that realization shifts the entire dynamic. Suddenly, you are no longer the one seeking clarity. You are the clarity. You are the steady presence that doesn't bend to ego, doesn't chase breadcrumbs, and doesn't confuse curiosity with commitment. This is emotional control in its highest form, not repression, not detachment, but self-mastery. And you'll find that the more you use silence wisely, the more peace you preserve. Because silence not only protects you from manipulation, it protects you from yourself, from the part of you that still wants to believe in potential, in what-ifs, in empty words dressed up as care. So let your silence speak. Let it do what words can't. Let it echo back to them the reality of your transformation. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to justify your delay. Your stillness says enough. If you're learning to respond with awareness instead of emotion, if you're discovering the strength of your own restraint, know this: you're walking in alignment with the Stoic way. Subscribe to True Stoic Way, and let every moment of silence bring you closer to the version of yourself no one can manipulate again. There comes a point when you no longer feel the need to explain yourself, to soften your tone, or to leave doors half open for those who once walked in and out of your life without knocking. And in that point, your language begins to shift not into cruelty, not into spite, but into precision. You begin to understand that not every reply requires warmth, not every response deserves depth, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is very little at all. The strategy of a cold, brief response is not one of arrogance, it is one of refined restraint. When someone who once disappeared decides to reappear with vague familiarity, hoping to slide back into the space they abandoned, you no longer offer them the comfort of emotional welcome. Instead, you meet their passive attempt at reconnection with something they never expected. Clarity wrapped in brevity. "I'm well. Hope you're doing okay. Everything's good. Here, take care. Thanks for checking in. All the best." These are not just phrases. They are surgical instruments. They cut through illusion, bypass nostalgia, and go directly to the heart of what the other person needs to see, but rarely dares to face. Because these replies don't carry affection. They don't hint at longing. They don't leave a trail of possibility behind them. They are the full stop to a sentence that was never meant to be continued. And that, more than any emotional outburst, shatters the illusion that they still matter to you the way they used to. When someone receives a message like that, what they're confronted with isn't hostility, it's their own irrelevance. It's the undeniable mirror that reflects the consequences of their absence. They were expecting some emotion, a flicker of familiarity, maybe even a return to the emotional rhythm they once controlled. But instead, they're met with coolness, not the coldness of revenge, but the coolness of someone who has outgrown the need for drama, reconciliation, or closure from external sources. You are not being rude when you answer with neutrality. You are being disciplined. You are not withholding affection out of malice. You are protecting your peace. Because once you've rebuilt yourself from the inside out, once you've reclaimed your emotional territory, you become incredibly cautious about who you allow back in, and more importantly, about how they are allowed to return. These short, calculated replies serve as thresholds. They're not invitations, they're tests. If someone truly cares, they won't stop at your emotional gate. They will knock with presence, with effort, with honesty. But those who came back simply to test their power, to see if they could still elicit a reaction, will feel the weight of your detachment like a wall they cannot climb. You see, a brief reply is not just a sentence. It is a statement of self. It says, "I've changed. I'm no longer living in the emotional shadow of who you remember." You're not speaking to the version of me that used to shrink for your comfort. It says, if you want access to me now, you're not entering through the same door you once left swinging behind you. You will have to knock on a door I built myself, one you don't recognize, one with locks you no longer hold the key to. There's a certain elegance in this kind of self-possession. You're not ignoring them. You're not ghosting. You're responding, but on your terms, in your voice, with your boundaries firmly intact. And that alone is more jarring to the person on the other end than any long message ever could be. Because they can't twist a short sentence. They can't pick apart what you never gave. They can't misinterpret the tone when there's no emotional code to decipher. You offered them nothing to feed off, and in doing so, you forced them to confront their own intentions and perhaps their own guilt. Think of your words like a mirror. When you reply with simplicity and stillness, they see themselves. Not the version they wanted you to remember, but the version you actually experienced, the one that left, the one that neglected, the one that failed to show up. And your calm reply reflects all of it without you needing to say a thing. This is what emotional maturity looks like, not in silence alone, but in the rare, intentional words you do choose to offer. Not because you want to restart the story, but because you want to end it with dignity. Not to hurt them, but to honor yourself. To draw the line with grace, to speak without weight, to reply without reopening wounds that have already closed. So, when they reach out again and you choose to respond, let your words be few, but let them carry weight. Let them reflect who you are now, not who you were when they last saw you. Let them stand as a quiet reminder that not everything broken deserves to be rebuilt, and not everyone who knocks deserves to be let back in. If you're learning the strength of measured words, if you're discovering how powerful it feels to choose clarity over chaos, then you're already walking the path of calm, controlled presence. Subscribe to True Stoic Way for more insights like these, and let your voice be quiet, but sharp. At first glance, the question seems innocent, even curious, disarming in its simplicity. Why did you disappear? 4 words, gentle in tone, coated with concern, delivered with a touch of nostalgia. It might come after a long silence, perhaps, following your short, indifferent reply, or in the wake of your refusal to re-engage in the way you once did. And yet, beneath the surface of that question lies something far less innocent than it appears, because more often than not, this isn't a genuine search for understanding. It is a subtle attempt to reclaim control over a dynamic they thought they had mastered. You see, when someone asks why you vanished, they're not necessarily seeking the truth of your experience. They're not prepared to hear about the slow erosion of your trust, the sleepless nights of unanswered questions, the quiet despair of waiting for something that never arrived. What they're really trying to uncover is whether they still matter, whether their absence left a mark, whether your silence was truly about you or still, somehow, about them. And in this way, the question is not an opening for vulnerability. It is a test disguised as tenderness to determine whether they still hold emotional leverage. But you have changed, and that changes everything. Because once upon a time, you might have poured your heart into that answer. You might have offered an honest account of your pain, your disappointment, your slow unraveling. You might have explained every moment you felt unseen, every moment you waited, every boundary you ignored just to feel close again. You might have hoped that by explaining your disappearance, you could make them understand what they failed to see when it mattered most. But now, you understand that not everyone deserves an explanation. That not every question deserves an answer, especially when the question itself is framed not in empathy, but in ego. Because disappearing wasn't your failure, it was your healing. You didn't go silent because you wanted to hurt them. You didn't step away because you were playing games. You withdrew because you had to. Because staying available to someone who only showed up on their terms was slowly tearing you apart. because the cost of being present for someone who treated your presence as disposable was far too high. And when the weight of being overlooked became heavier than the fear of being alone, you chose solitude, not out of bitterness, but out of survival. So when they ask, "Why did you disappear?" you don't owe them an emotional novel. You don't need to unravel your silence into digestible pieces for their comfort. You don't need to frame your departure in ways that protect their feelings. One sentence firm, calm, complete is enough. I found myself. And in that single phrase, the power dynamic shifts, because I found myself is not an answer designed to soothe them. It is a declaration of evolution. It speaks volumes without explaining a thing. It affirms that the silence they once dismissed as distance was, in truth, the cocoon of your transformation. It tells them that your absence was not passive, it was intentional. That you didn't vanish because you were lost, but because you were rediscovering your worth in a space where their noise could no longer distract you. What they expected was guilt. What they hoped for was vulnerability. What they were ready to exploit was your desire to be understood. But what they encountered instead was certainty. And that changes the entire script. Because now, they are no longer the one defining the conversation. They are no longer the one holding the upper hand, asking the questions, setting the emotional pace. Now they are on the outside, staring into a version of you that is foreign, calm, and untouchable, not because you've become cold, but because you've become whole. And that wholeness is the very thing they cannot comprehend. You used to be the one who explained, who justified, who shrank your truth to make room for their comfort. But you've stopped doing that. You've learned that real transformation doesn't need to be narrated. It simply needs to be lived. Your silence, in and of itself, was the answer. It was the statement. It was the mirror. It was the consequence they never expected. And the more they ask why, the clearer it becomes that they still don't understand that disappearing was not something done to them. It was something done for you, because people who truly cared would not have let you reach that edge of absence without first reaching in. They would not have required your silence to notice your suffering. They would not have needed your distance to recognize your value. And the fact that it took you vanishing for them to ask why only proves that your presence was never really seen to begin with. So no, you don't owe them the story. You don't owe them the breakdown, the confession, the retracing of your emotional wounds. What you owe first and foremost is your continued alignment with the peace you've created. The boundary you built through every unspoken moment. The dignity you reassembled through every unanswered text. Every withheld reply. Every late night you chose to sit with your solitude instead of reaching for temporary connection. Because when they ask, "Why did you disappear?" the real answer is this: you weren't listening when I was still speaking. So I let my silence speak louder. And if they still don't understand what that silence meant, then perhaps they were never listening in the first place. If you're ready to let your silence speak for your evolution, if you're tired of apologizing for boundaries you had every right to create, then stay on this path. Subscribe to True Stoic Way and keep walking toward the version of you that doesn't explain growth, but embodies it. There was a time not so long ago when you would have given anything to hear from them again. You checked your phone in silence, replayed old conversations like lullabies for a restless heart, convinced yourself that if they just reached out, if they just came back with even the faintest sign of regret, things might finally feel whole again. You didn't want revenge, you wanted closure. You didn't crave power, you craved peace. You waited not passively, but with the quiet ache of someone who had too much hope and nowhere safe to place it. And though you carried on, though life kept moving, a part of you lingered at the doorway of that unfinished chapter, hoping that one day they would return, not because they had to, but because they finally saw what they had failed to value. And now, they're back. The message arrived. The name appeared. The moment you used to dream of has finally happened. But something's different now, something they didn't anticipate. Because while they've come searching for the version of you who once waited, they've found someone else entirely. Someone steady, someone unmoved, someone whose silence is not wounded, but self-contained. They came back to find the echo of your desperation, and instead, they've met the stillness of your dignity. And that is where their ego begins to fracture, because nothing wounds the pride of someone who once controlled the emotional tempo. Like discovering that the song no longer plays for them. They were so sure that their reappearance would ignite something inside you, a rush of warmth, a cascade of memories, a spark of old emotion that would override everything you've built since. But what they didn't expect was the calm, the clarity, the absolute absence of need in your eyes. You are not hostile. You are not bitter. You simply no longer orbit their gravity. That, to them, is unbearable. They had always thought of your softness as eternal, as if your kindness were a guarantee, not a gift. As if your forgiveness were an open faucet, ready to pour again at the first touch. As if your vulnerability was a well they could dip into whenever their thirst for validation returned. But what they didn't realize is that the well has dried not out of cruelty, but out of evolution. Because the person you are now didn't grow in sunlight. You didn't become this strong by being held. You became this strong in the absence of holding. You forged this stillness in nights full of silence, in mornings full of restraint, in moments when you chose not to reach out, even though every cell in your body screamed for connection. You didn't just heal, you transformed. And that transformation didn't require applause, didn't beg for recognition. It happened in shadows, in solitude, in stillness. And now, standing before them, you carry yourself like someone who no longer bends, not because you've hardened, but because you've become whole. They may not say it outright, but you can feel the confusion radiating through their words. They don't understand this version of you, the one who replies without warmth, who listens without leaning forward, who no longer tries to fill every silence with softness. They thought time would have softened you, made you more receptive, more nostalgic. But time, as it turns out, has only strengthened your boundaries. It has crystallized your understanding of worth. And in that understanding, you no longer mistake their return as redemption. To them, your stillness feels like a wall. But to you, it's simply a foundation. Because this isn't about getting even. This isn't about withholding as punishment. This isn't about flipping the script for the sake of dominance. No, this is about recognizing that they no longer hold the ability to shift your center. That their presence no longer excites your nervous system, no longer clouds your judgment, no longer lures you back into cycles you've already outgrown. You don't tremble anymore when they text. You don't stare at the screen, wondering what it means. You don't assign meaning to crumbs. You require substance now, consistency, truth, and anything less than that doesn't trigger you. It bores you. And that indifference, more than any angry silence, more than any blocked number, is what breaks their ego. Because they didn't just want access to you, they wanted access to the version of you who needed them. The version who waited. The version who would still light up at their shadow. But that version no longer exists. That version was buried beneath your boundaries. That version was left behind the day you stopped explaining yourself to people who never truly listened. So now, as they stand before you, digitally or in person, what they encounter is not the wall of someone who wants to push them away, but the calm, immovable presence of someone who no longer invites them in. The door isn't locked, it's simply closed. Not as a statement of defiance, but as a quiet, dignified truth. They no longer live here. This home you've built, this new inner landscape of peace and presence and unwavering self-respect, is not one they helped construct. And therefore, they are not entitled to enter. Let them stand there. Let them reflect. Let them feel what it's like to knock and not be expected. Let them learn what it means to be on the outside of a peace they once took for granted. Because the most devastating realization for anyone who thought you'd always be available is not that you're angry, it's that you've evolved. And when evolution closes the door, it doesn't slam it. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to dot. It simply closes and walks away. If you've ever been told you were too distant after choosing peace, remember this. Your silence is not rejection, it's redirection. Subscribe to True Stoic. Way to continue walking the path of clarity, where no one gets to return unless they're ready to meet the version of you who no longer waits. At some point in your journey, you come to understand that the question isn't whether you should respond or stay silent, it's why. Because in truth, the act itself, whether you tap a reply or leave the message unopened, is never as significant as the place within you from which that decision emerges. When you operate from need, even your silence can become a performance. But when you act from clarity, every choice, worded or wordless, becomes an extension of your inner freedom. And that's where real power begins to take shape, not in reaction, not in restraint for the sake of pride, but in sovereign, grounded awareness that you see, we live in a world that demands explanations. You didn't reply, you must be bitter. You waited days, you must be playing games. You closed the door, you must be hiding pain. But what most people can't comprehend is that your silence isn't a mask for suppressed emotion. It's the full expression of your emotional discipline. It's the space where you no longer owe anyone your voice, and where you no longer confuse being accessible with being kind. Because let's be honest, there was a time when you believed you had to respond to stay good. That silence made you look petty. That not replying meant you were avoiding growth. But growth doesn't always sound like vulnerability. Sometimes it sounds like nothing at all. Not because you're closed off, but because you've learned that not every message deserves access to your evolved self. And in that silence, you're not frozen, you're free. You don't respond. Not because you want to hurt someone, but because you don't want to hurt yourself again. You don't reply not because you're holding a grudge, but because you're holding a standard. A standard that says, if I am to give my energy, my presence, my voice, it will be a conscious offering, not a conditioned reflex. This is the difference between reaction and response, between impulse and intention, between the past version of you that moved from emptiness and the present version of you that acts only from fullness. The truth is, real freedom isn't about choosing to reply or not reply. It's about not needing to explain either one. It's about being able to look at that message and know that whatever you do next, you do it from stillness, not from scarcity. You do it from wholeness, not from hunger. And that subtle shift, that internal realignment, is what separates the person who's still waiting to be understood from the person who has learned to understand themselves. They may never know why you didn't reply. They may wonder, they may project, they may write their own story about your silence. But none of that is your concern anymore. Because what you've built inside, this garden of self-worth, this fortress of discernment, this space of peace, that no longer bends to old habits, is not open to just any visitor who knocks with familiarity. It is sacred. And sacred things do not rush. Sacred things do not explain. Sacred things do not chase. And so you sit in that stillness, not out of apathy, but out of alignment. You don't rush to reassure. You don't collapse into old scripts. You don't let their curiosity become your obligation. Because you've realized something that most people never do. Not all presence is love. Not all words are healing. And not all reconnections are meant to be revived. This is what it means to be awake, not emotionally numb, but emotionally selective. To understand that every word you send out carries your energy, that every sentence is an invitation, that every response is an agreement. And if what they're offering is confusion, inconsistency, or ego disguised as kindness, then your silence is not rejection. It is refusal to enter a space where clarity is absent. It took time to get here. You know that. You didn't become this clear overnight. You sat with confusion. You sat with longing. You sat with the ache of silence and resisted the urge to break it. You sat with the ghost of old versions of yourself who would have responded just to feel alive again. And now, sitting here, holding that message in your hand, you're not battling anymore. You're just choosing. And that quiet, unapologetic choosing is everything. So whether you decide to reply or not, know this: the decision is yours, and that alone is power. Not in how you wield it over others, but in how you reclaim it for yourself. Let them wonder why you didn't say more. Let them sit in the space you no longer fill. Let them meet the stillness they once created in you, and realize they are no longer welcome in the home they once left. And if one day you do choose to speak, let it be not to reopen a door, but to affirm that your silence was never a wall. It was a threshold, a rite of passage, a boundary lined with self-respect. And only those who move with truth, with presence, with intention, deserve to cross it. If this video touched something within you, don't keep it to yourself. Let it be a light for someone else still stuck in the shadows. Subscribe to True Stoic Way, because every video here is a sharpened blade of truth, crafted to awaken your clarity and restore your power. No one can pull you back into the darkness unless you forget that you've already walked out. You didn't slam the door. You didn't shout. You didn't offer a final monologue that begged to be understood. You simply stepped back, quietly, deliberately, and disappeared, not into bitterness, not into darkness, but into yourself. And while they expected anger, noise, or even closure in the form of drama. What you gave them instead was the kind of silence that echoes louder than any farewell. Because in that stillness, you weren't vanishing, you were transforming. Were building something invisible to them, but undeniable within you. A sense of presence that no longer needed to announce itself. A kind of dignity that didn't rise from validation, but from solitude. And though they may never truly grasp it, your departure became your loudest boundary, your softest revolution. You didn't leave because you gave up. You left because you finally saw that staying was costing you more than walking away ever would. What they now feel in your absence is not just the loss of a person. It is the collapse of a dynamic they depended on. A rhythm where they spoke and you danced. Where they withdrew and you reached. But that rhythm is broken now, not because you snapped it in defiance, but because you simply stopped playing music for someone who was never truly listening. And that's the part they cannot process. The realization that the version of you who once waited at the edge of every message is gone. That your silence is not a pause. It's an ending. Not filled with hatred, but humming with clarity. You've become someone they no longer recognize. Not because you've become cruel, but because you've become composed. Your silence now stands like a monolith in their memory, a presence that needs no voice, a boundary that offers no apology, a door that doesn't need to lock because no one dares to knock twice once they met the truth behind it. Let them keep refreshing the chat. Let them wonder if you'll reply. Let them feel the emptiness that once lived in you and understand it was never theirs to play with. Because in the end, you didn't just disappear, you rose. And the space you left behind, it wasn't empty, it was sacred. If this journey spoke to something buried inside you, if you've ever disappeared quietly and wondered whether that choice was right, know this. Your silence was not weakness, it was wisdom. And the one who walks in silence walks with power. Subscribe to True Stoic Way, because every video here is a sharpened blade of truth, forged in fire and silence, offered to those who no longer wish to live on their knees. Number 1 can pull you back into the dark, unless you forget that you've already stepped into the light.